The glass tower reflected nothing but power and money, and Amara Collins in her red delivery uniform was invisible to every executive who walked past. They were desperate. A $200 million deal with a Chinese firm was collapsing despite professional translators. When Amara entered the boardroom to deliver lunch, they continued negotiating in front of her, assuming she understood nothing. But they didn't know that this quiet delivery girl understood every word being said in Mandarin, learned during 3 years in Chinese factories where bad translations cost her mother everything. And when the translator deliberately softened what the Chinese executives actually said, Amara was about to do something that would change everything. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning sun reflected off the glass tower like a mirror, blinding and cold. Amara stood at the base of the building, one hand gripping the strap of her delivery backpack, the other shielding her eyes as she looked up. 50 stories of steel and ambition stretched toward the sky, each window a reminder that she didn't belong here. Her red uniform seemed to glow against the polished marble entrance, marking her as an outsider before she even stepped inside. The building loomed over her like a monument to everything she wasn't: wealth, power, belonging. Yet here she stood, about to walk through those doors anyway. She took a breath and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby hit her immediately with its silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that made you aware of every sound you made. Her sneakers squeaked against the floor despite her careful steps. The space was enormous, decorated with abstract art she didn't understand and furniture that looked like it cost more than her rent. Everything here was designed to make you feel small if you weren't supposed to be big. Amara kept her eyes forward and headed toward the security desk. "Can I help you?" The guard didn't look up from his computer screen. His tone made it clear he'd already decided she was a problem. "Delivery for the 14th floor," Amara said, keeping her voice steady and professional. She'd learned that lesson early. Don't give them a reason. "Name?" "Amara Collins." He typed something slowly, like he was doing her a favor by even checking. "You're not in the system. I was called in this morning. It's an urgent order." The guard finally looked at her, his eyes moving from her face to her uniform to her backpack like he was cataloging evidence. "Urgent orders go through the main catering service." "You with them?" "No, sir. Independent contractor." He sighed, the kind of sigh that said this was more trouble than she was worth. "Wait here." He picked up a phone and turned away from her, speaking in a low voice she couldn't quite hear. Amara stepped back from the desk and stood near a marble column. Around her, people in expensive suits moved through the lobby with purpose, their shoes clicking against the floor in rhythms that suggested they had somewhere important to be. No one looked at her directly, but she felt their awareness. A few slowed their pace as they passed, their eyes sliding toward her and then away, registering her presence and dismissing it in the same moment. 2 women in their 30s walked by, their voices carrying. "Did you see the email about the Chinese deal?" "God, don't remind me." "Patricia's losing her mind up there." "Well, if the translator keeps screwing up." "It's not just the translator. The whole thing is a disaster." They disappeared into an elevator, their conversation cut off by closing doors. Amara filed the information away automatically. It was a habit she developed years ago, listening to what people said when they thought no one was paying attention. Most people didn't realize how much they revealed when they believed they were invisible to the person standing right in front of them. The guard returned, his expression unchanged. "Someone's coming down to verify." "Stay here." "Thank you." She waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Her backpack was getting heavy, the weight pulling at her shoulders, but she didn't adjust it. Movement drew attention, and attention meant questions, and questions meant delays. A group of young professionals clustered near the elevator bank, their laughter loud and confident, the kind of laughter that comes from never having to worry about whether you belong somewhere. One of them, a white man in his 20s with gelled hair and an expensive watch, noticed her and nudged his friend. "Think she's lost?" he said, not quite whispering. His friend, a blonde woman holding a coffee cup, glanced over. "Probably can't read the directory." They laughed, Not meanly, but like she was part of a joke they were all in on. Like her confusion would be the funniest part of their morning. Amara kept her face neutral. She'd heard worse. The trick was not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd landed a hit. She adjusted her grip on her backpack strap and kept waiting. Finally, a harried-looking man in his 40s emerged from the elevator, his phone pressed to his ear. He spotted her and waved impatiently. "You the delivery?" "Yes, sir." "Come on, we're already behind." He didn't wait for her to respond, just turned and headed back toward the elevator. Amara followed quickly, her sneakers squeaking again on the polished floor. They rode up in silence. The man kept typing on his phone, his jaw tight with stress. Amara watched the floor numbers climb, noting how the elevator slowed at the 10th floor, where a woman in a navy suit got on and immediately stepped as far from Amara as the small space allowed. The 14th floor was chaos disguised as professionalism. The doors opened onto an open-plan office space where assistants moved between cubicles with stacks of paper and worried expressions. Glass-walled conference rooms lined the perimeter, and in the largest one at the far end, Amara could see figures moving behind frosted glass. "Just leave it in the break room," the man said, pointing vaguely to his left. "Second door." "Actually, I was told to bring it to the boardroom. Someone specifically requested." "The boardroom?" He looked at her like she'd suggested flying there. "That's not happening." "Sir, I'm just following the instructions I was given." He muttered something under his breath and made another call, walking away from her. Amara stood in the middle of the office floor, suddenly aware of how many people had stopped to stare. She was a disruption, a red uniform in a sea of gray and navy, someone who didn't fit the carefully maintained aesthetic of the space. A young black woman, maybe a few years older than Amara, approached from one of the cubicles. She wore a professional dress and a tired smile. "You okay?" "Just waiting for clearance." "For what?" "Apparently, bringing food to people who ordered it is complicated." The woman laughed softly. "Everything's complicated today. The big deal upstairs is falling apart, and everyone's pretending it's not their fault." She lowered her voice. "Fair warning, they're not in a good mood up there. Thanks for the heads up. I'm Nicole, by the way." "Amara." Nicole nodded and headed back to her desk, but something about the brief exchange made Amara feel slightly less invisible. It was a small thing, being acknowledged as a person, but small things mattered when you spent most of your day being treated like furniture. The man returned, his expression even more stressed than before. "Fine, you can go up. But make it quick, don't talk to anyone, and definitely don't touch anything." "Understood." He led her to another elevator, this one smaller and clearly meant for executive access. They rode up 3 more floors in uncomfortable silence. When the doors opened, the atmosphere shifted immediately. This wasn't the organized chaos of the 14th floor. This was controlled panic, the kind that happened when important people were about to lose important things. The space was darker, more refined. Wooden panels replaced drywall, and the carpet was thick enough to silence footsteps. Assistants moved with purpose, their voices hushed, their faces tight. Through the glass walls of the main conference room, Amara could see a long table surrounded by executives. A large screen dominated one wall, currently showing a frozen video call interface. "Wait here," the man said, disappearing into a side office. Amara set her backpack down carefully and took in the scene. The conference room door was open just enough for sound to escape. A woman's voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the air. "I don't care what the contract says in theory. I care what it means in practice. Can someone please give me a translator who actually understands the difference?" Amara recognized power when she heard it. This was someone used to getting exactly what she wanted when she wanted it, with no room for excuses. The kind of person who measured worth in results and had no patience for failure. Another voice, male, older. "Patricia, we've been over this 3 times. The language isn't the problem." "Then what is, Michael?" "Because from where I'm sitting, we're about to lose a $200 million deal because nobody in this room can communicate basic contract terms without creating an international incident." Silence followed, the heavy kind, where everyone knew better than to speak. Amara moved slightly closer, not enough to be obvious, but enough to hear better. Through the gap in the door, she could see the woman named Patricia, tall, white, maybe 50, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and a gray suit that probably cost more than Amara made in 3 months. She stood at the head of the table, her hands pressed flat against the polished wood, her entire posture radiating frustration. "Where's the food?" someone called from inside the room. The harried man who'd brought Amara up suddenly appeared at her elbow. "That's you. Go." Amara picked up her backpack and walked toward the conference room. Every eye in the room turned toward her as she entered, and she felt the familiar weight of judgment settle on her shoulders. She was the help, the person who brought things and took things away. The person you didn't really see because seeing her would mean acknowledging she was there. She started unpacking the order, sandwiches, salads, bottled drinks, arranging them on the side table with practiced efficiency. "Can someone call him back?" Patricia asked, ignoring Amara completely. "We need to at least attempt to salvage this before they officially walk." "Calling now," an assistant said, typing rapidly on a laptop. Amara worked quietly, her hands steady as she set out napkins and utensils. But her ears were working overtime, catching fragments of conversation that painted a picture of disaster. A deal with a Chinese firm. Miscommunication. Cultural mistakes. Pride getting in the way of progress. A junior executive, white, male, mid-30s, grabbed a sandwich without looking at her. "At least we have food. Small victories, right?" His colleague, a woman about the same age, laughed without humor. "If this deal dies, we're all going to need more than sandwiches." The video call connected. The screen flickered to life, showing a conference room on the other side of the world. 3 Chinese executives sat at a table, their expressions formal and unreadable. The man in the center, perhaps 60, wore glasses and a dark suit. His posture was perfect, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Good morning," Patricia said, her voice suddenly warm and diplomatic. "Thank you for agreeing to continue our discussion." The man in the center nodded slightly. When he spoke, his English was clear but accented. "We are willing to listen. However, we have concerns that must be addressed." "Of course. We've reviewed the contract points you raised yesterday, and I believe there were some translation issues that created confusion." "With respect, Ms. Patterson," the man interrupted gently. "The confusion was not in translation. The confusion was in intention." Patricia's smile tightened. "I'm not sure I understand." An older woman sitting beside Patricia leaned forward. This was clearly the translator, a white woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose. "What Mr. Chen means?" "Mr. Zhang." Amara thought automatically, catching the pronunciation error, but she kept her mouth shut and continued arranging drinks. The translator continued. "What Mr. Chen is expressing is concern about the implementation timeline." On screen, one of the Chinese executives said something in Mandarin to Mr. Zhang. The words were quick, clipped. Amara understood them perfectly. She's doing it again. Mr. Zhang's expression didn't change, but there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested frustration. He responded in English. "Yes, the timeline is one concern, but there are others." Patricia glanced at the translator, who looked flustered. "Can you be more specific?" Another exchange in Mandarin on the screen. This time, the woman sitting to Mr. Zhang's left spoke, her tone sharper than his. Amara caught the words clearly. "They're not listening. They're performing listening." The translator cleared her throat. "They're saying they want more specificity in the contract language." That wasn't what they'd said at all. Amara kept her face neutral, but her mind was racing. The translator wasn't incompetent. She was diplomatic to the point of dishonesty, smoothing over criticisms that needed to be heard. "We can certainly work on specificity," Patricia said, her voice strained. "Michael, can you pull up section 12? A man at the laptop began scrolling through a document. On screen, the Chinese executives waited with the patience of people who'd already made up their minds. Amara finished setting out the food and stepped back toward the door, trying to be invisible. But invisibility was a double-edged sword. It meant people didn't see you, which meant they said things they shouldn't. "This is a nightmare," someone whispered near her. A young executive, white, female, 20s, scrolling through her phone. If this falls through, Patricia's going to burn the whole floor down. Her companion, another young woman, nodded. At least the delivery girl doesn't understand this mess. Lucky her. They both laughed, soft and bitter, and Amara felt something twist in her chest. Not anger. Not exactly. More like recognition, the kind that came from years of experience. She'd been the person in the room who supposedly didn't understand for most of her life. It was a role she knew well, one that came with its own kind of power if you knew how to use it. On screen, Mr. Zhang spoke again in Mandarin, his tone shifting into something more formal, more final. Amara caught the words, and her stomach dropped. If they cannot show respect in translation, they will not show respect in partnership. The translator hesitated, clearly catching the severity. Mr. Chun is saying that mutual respect is essential for moving forward. Zhang, Amara thought again. His name is Zhang. Patricia leaned forward, her diplomatic mask slipping slightly. We absolutely agree. Respect is the foundation of this partnership. That's why we're committed to addressing every concern you've raised. Every concern? Mr. Zhang asked. Or every concern you believe we have raised? Patricia blinked. I'm not sure I follow. The translator jumped in. I think what he's asking is, I am asking, Mr. Zhang said, his English suddenly sharper, if you are hearing what we are saying or what you wish we were saying. The room went quiet. Patricia's hand curled into a fist on the table, her knuckles white. I assure you, we are listening very carefully. On screen, the woman executive said something else in Mandarin. Her tone was pointed, almost mocking, carefully but not accurately. The translator didn't translate it. She just smiled nervously and said, They appreciate your attention to detail. Amara felt her jaw tighten. This wasn't just miscommunication. This was deliberate misrepresentation, a buffer between what was being said and what was being heard. And it was making everything worse. Mr. Zhang glanced at his colleagues, and something unspoken passed between them. When he looked back at the camera, his expression was polite but distant. Perhaps we should take a recess. Allow everyone time to reconsider their positions. That's not necessary, Patricia said quickly. We can work through this right now. I believe it is necessary, Mr. Zhang said firmly. We will reconvene tomorrow. Same time. The screen went dark before anyone could respond. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with failure and blame. Patricia stood frozen at the head of the table, her face pale with barely controlled rage. Then she turned on the translator. What just happened? I'm not entirely sure. You're not sure? You're the translator. Your job is to be sure. Patricia, she did her best. Michael started. Her best isn't good enough. Patricia's voice cracked through the room. We just lost a $200 million deal because her best couldn't bridge a simple language gap. The translator's face flushed. With respect, the issue isn't just language. There are cultural nuances. Then explain them. That's what we're paying you for. Amara stood by the door, her delivery bag still on her shoulder, watching the implosion with careful eyes. She should leave. This wasn't her problem, wasn't her world, wasn't her fight. But something kept her rooted to the spot, some instinct that told her this moment mattered more than it appeared. A junior executive near the back of the room caught sight of her and frowned. Is she still here? Patricia's head snapped toward Amara. Who are you? Delivery, ma'am. I was just finishing. Then finish and get out. Yes, ma'am. Amara turned toward the door, but as she did, she heard Michael mutter under his breath. Maybe we should just let them walk. Cut our losses. Losses? Patricia's laugh was sharp. Michael, if this deal dies, it's not just losses. It's careers, including yours. Amara paused at the door, her hand on the frame. She shouldn't ask. She should walk away, collect her payment, and forget this place existed. But the words came anyway, quiet and careful. Mom, can I ask what the deal is about? Every head in the room turned toward her. Patricia stared like Amara had just suggested setting the building on fire. Excuse me? The deal. With the Chinese firm. What's it about? Patricia's expression shifted from shock to irritation. That is none of your business. I understand. I just thought. Sometimes an outside perspective helps. An outside perspective, Patricia's voice dripped with condescension. From a delivery girl, someone in the back laughed. Not loudly, but loud enough. Amara felt the heat rise in her face, but kept her voice level. Yes, ma'am. Sometimes the person who's not in the middle of something can see it more clearly. What we need, Patricia said slowly, like she was explaining something to a child, is competent translation and cultural understanding, not amateur advice from someone delivering sandwiches. Of course. My apologies. Amara stepped out of the conference room and pulled the door closed behind her. Her heart was pounding, her hands shaking slightly as she walked toward the elevator. Behind her, she heard the muffled sound of raised voices, the argument picking up again now that the outsider was gone. She pressed the elevator button and waited, trying to steady her breathing. The thing about being invisible was that people never expected you to speak. And when you did, they treated it like a violation, like you'd broken some unspoken rule about knowing your place. The elevator arrived empty. Amara stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, she heard footsteps running toward her. Wait! Nicole, the woman from the 14th floor, caught the door with her hand. She slipped inside, slightly breathless. Hey, you okay? Fine. I heard what happened up there. Patricia's a piece of work. Amara managed a small smile. It's not the worst thing anyone said to me today. Still doesn't make it right. Nicole hesitated. For what it's worth, you were right. Sometimes outside perspectives do help, especially when everyone inside is too busy protecting their own interests to see straight. The elevator descended in silence for a moment. Can I ask you something? Nicole said. Sure. Why'd you ask about the deal? Most people wouldn't care. Amara considered the question. The honest answer was complicated, rooted in years of watching people in power make decisions that hurt people without power, all while convincing themselves they were doing the right thing. But that was too much to explain to someone she'd just met. I guess I'm curious, she said instead, about how things fall apart. Nicole nodded slowly. Well, if you want to see a masterclass in things falling apart, you picked the right day. The elevator reached the lobby. They stepped out together, and Nicole paused before heading back toward the security desk. Hey, Amara, if you ever get tired of delivery work, we're always looking for good people. People who pay attention. Thanks. I'll keep that in mind. Amara walked back through the lobby, past the security guard who didn't look up, past the executives who still didn't see her, and out into the sunlight. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the noise of the city wash over her. Her phone buzzed. Another delivery request, another address, another room where she'd be invisible. She accepted it and started walking. But something had shifted. The conference room scene replayed in her mind. The mistranslations, the cultural missteps, the way the Chinese executives had looked at each other with resigned frustration. She'd seen that look before, years ago, in very different circumstances. It was the look of people who knew they weren't being heard, who understood that the problem wasn't language, but willingness to listen. Amara kept walking, her delivery bag bouncing against her hip, her mind already somewhere else. The afternoon sun was harsh now, warming the pavement beneath her feet. She made 3 more deliveries that day, each one blending into the next in a blur of addresses and polite nods. But her thoughts kept returning to that conference room, to the way Mr. Zhang's expression had closed off when the translator failed him again, to the way Patricia had looked at her like she was nothing. That evening, Amara sat in her small apartment, the kind of place where you could touch opposite walls if you stretched out your arms. It was clean but sparse, a bed, a small table, a kitchenette with 2 burners. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through the plaster. Some game show where people screamed over prizes they'd probably forget about in a week. She heated up leftovers and ate standing at the counter, her phone propped against the wall, playing videos she wasn't really watching. But her mind wouldn't settle. It kept circling back to the mistranslations, the deliberate softening of sharp words, the way meaning had been smoothed away until nothing real remained. She'd seen it before. Years ago, in a different country, in a different language, but the pattern was the same. People in power deciding what truth was convenient and what truth was dangerous. And the translator, whether through fear or complicity, becoming an accomplice to the distortion. Amara pulled out her laptop, an old model that took forever to boot up, and opened a search engine. She typed in the company name she'd seen on the building directory, Meridian Global Solutions. The results flooded her screen: press releases about expansion, articles about innovative partnerships, stock prices that told the story of a company on the rise. She dug deeper, clicking through news articles and financial reports. The Chinese deal was mentioned in several places, always described in vague terms: strategic partnership, mutually beneficial arrangement, landmark cooperation. The kind of language that sounded important without actually saying anything. But buried in one financial blog post, she found something more specific. The deal involved technology transfers, manufacturing partnerships, and supply chain integration across 3 continents. The numbers were massive, not just the 200 million Patricia had mentioned, but projections that climbed into the billions over the next decade. No wonder Patricia was desperate. A deal that size could define a career, build a legacy, secure a future. Losing it would be catastrophic. Amara closed her laptop and stared at the ceiling, her thoughts spinning in circles. She should forget about it. It wasn't her world, wasn't her problem, and getting involved would only bring trouble. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. People didn't like it when you saw things they wanted to keep hidden. They especially didn't like it when you pointed those things out. But something Nicole had said kept echoing in her mind: people who pay attention. Amara had been paying attention her whole life. It was how she'd survived in places where not paying attention meant getting hurt. It was how she'd learned Mandarin in the first place, by listening to every word, every tone shift, every cultural nuance that separated what people said from what they meant. Her phone rang, making her jump. She didn't recognize the number. "Hello. Is this Amara Collins?" A woman's voice, professional, slightly rushed. "Yes. Who's this?" "My name is Jennifer Kim. I work in HR at Meridian Global Solutions. I understand you made a delivery to our offices this morning." Amara's grip tightened on the phone. "That's right. I'm calling because we received an unusual request from one of our business partners. They've asked that you be present at tomorrow's negotiation session." "I'm sorry, what?" "The Chinese delegation specifically requested your presence. They said," Jennifer paused, and Amara could hear paper rustling. "They said you demonstrated cultural awareness and linguistic understanding that would be valuable to the proceedings." Amara sat down on her bed, her mind racing. "I'm a delivery worker. I don't have any credentials." They're aware of that, but they were very insistent. They said if you're not present, they'll postpone the meeting indefinitely. The weight of that statement settled over Amara like a blanket. The Chinese executives had just given her leverage, whether she wanted it or not. They'd seen something in that brief moment when she'd stood in the doorway, listening, understanding. They'd recognized that she knew the translator was failing them. "What does Patricia say about this?" Amara asked carefully. "Ms. Patterson is evaluating the situation. But the reality is, we need this deal to proceed. If your presence facilitates that, then we're prepared to compensate you for your time." "Compensate me how?" $1,000 for tomorrow's session. Additional compensation if your involvement continues beyond that. $1,000. That was more than Amara made in 2 weeks of delivery work. It was enough to pay next month's rent with money left over. It was enough to matter. But it was also a trap. She could feel it, the way you could feel a storm coming before the first drop of rain. Accepting this meant stepping into a world where the rules were different, where power moved in ways she didn't fully understand, where being useful could quickly turn into being used. "Can I think about it?" Amara asked. "I need an answer by 8 o'clock tonight. The meeting is scheduled for 9 tomorrow morning. I'll call you back." Amara ended the call and sat in silence. Through the wall, the game show continued, people shrieking over prizes. Outside, sirens wailed past, the city's eternal soundtrack. She thought about her mother, about the way she'd looked when she'd been fired for understanding too much, about the years that followed, the struggle to rebuild, the quiet anger that had settled into resignation. Her mother had taught her that sometimes the only way to survive was to stay small, stay quiet, stay invisible. But her mother had also taught her Mandarin, spending hours with her in their cramped kitchen, drilling her on tones and characters and the subtle ways meaning could shift with a single word. She'd taught her that language was power, that understanding was survival, that knowing what people really meant could mean the difference between getting hurt and getting ahead. Amara picked up her phone and dialed the number Jennifer had called from. "This is Amara Collins. I'll be there tomorrow. But I have one condition." "What's that?" I translate honestly. Everything that's said, exactly as it's said. No softening, no editing, no diplomatique revorging. The truth, even when it's uncomfortable. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'll have to clear that with Ms. Patterson." "Then clear it. Because if I can't do it honestly, I won't do it at all." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll call you back within the hour." "I'll be waiting." Amara ended the call and realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the sudden weight of consequence. She'd just drawn a line, and there was no undrawing it. Either they'd accept her terms, and she'd walk into that boardroom as something more than furniture, or they'd refuse, and she'd go back to delivering sandwiches to people who didn't see her. She didn't know which outcome scared her more. 50 minutes later, her phone rang again. It was Jennifer. "Ms. Collins?" "Jennifer Kimmel. Ms. Patterson has agreed to your terms. We'll see you tomorrow at 8:45. Security will be expecting you." "Thank you. One more thing. Ms. Patterson wanted me to tell you that she expects professional conduct at all times. This is a high-stakes negotiation, and there's absolutely no room for error." "Understood. Tell her I feel the same way about honest, accurate translation." Amara could almost hear Jennifer's warm smile through the phone. "I will. See you tomorrow." That night, Amara barely slept. She lay in bed reviewing Mandarin grammar in her head, testing herself on business vocabulary, running through scenarios where cultural nuance could make or break a negotiation. She thought about Mr. Zhang's face on that video screen, the way his patience had worn down, frayed into something close to contempt. She thought about the other executives beside him, the woman who'd said they're performing listening with such cutting, devastating accuracy. They deserved better than performance. They deserved the truth. And tomorrow, Amara would make sure they got it. She didn't know it yet, but she'd be back in that building soon. And next time, she wouldn't stay quiet. The previous evening had ended with Amara accepting an impossible task, to translate honestly in a room full of people who'd built careers on convenient lies. Now, as morning light filtered through her apartment window, the weight of that decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She arrived at Meridian Global Solutions at 8:45 exactly, wearing the only professional clothes she owned, black pants and a white blouse that she'd bought for a job interview 2 years ago. The outfit felt like a costume, like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. But then again, maybe that was the point. Everyone in this building was pretending to be something. Security waved her through without the hassle from yesterday. Someone had clearly updated the system. A young assistant, a white woman in her 20s with nervous energy, met her at the elevator bank. "Ms. Collins? I'm Rachel. I'll take you up to the conference room. Ms. Patterson wanted me to brief you on the way." "Okay." They stepped into the elevator, and Rachel pulled out a tablet, scrolling through notes with quick, practiced fingers. "So, the Chinese delegation will be joining via video conference at 9. The primary contact is Mr. Zhang Wei, CEO of Tianlong Industries. With him will be..." "Zhang Wei," Amara interrupted gently. "Not Wei Zhang. Family name first." Rachel blinked. "Oh, right. I'll make sure everyone knows that." She made a note on her tablet, then continued. "The deal involves technology transfer agreements, manufacturing partnerships, and supply chain integration. The sticking point has been intellectual property protections and liability clauses. What does the Chinese side actually want? We're not entirely sure. The translations have been unclear, or the translations have been very clear, and nobody wanted to hear them." Rachel's fingers stopped moving on the tablet. She looked at Amara with something like relief. "Yeah, probably that." The elevator doors opened onto the 17th floor. The conference room was already filling with people, executives in suits, assistants with laptops, legal counsel with thick binders. Patricia stood at the head of the table, talking intensely with an older man in an expensive suit. When she saw Amara, her expression flickered with something that might have been resentment before settling back into professional neutrality. "Ms. Collins, thank you for coming." Patricia's voice was polite but cold, like she was greeting a necessary inconvenience. "You'll be sitting here." She gestured to a chair near the middle of the table, not at the head where the official translator sat, but not relegated to the back either. A strategic middle ground. Amara sat down and took in the room. There were at least 15 people present, all of them watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. She recognized a few faces from yesterday. Michael, the older executive who'd suggested cutting losses, and several junior staff members who'd laughed at her expense. The official translator, the woman from yesterday, sat 2 seats down from Patricia. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting she'd been up all night preparing. When she caught Amara's eye, there was no hostility there, just weary resignation. She knew what was coming. At exactly 9 o'clock, the large screen at the end of the room flickered to life. Mr. Zhang appeared, flanked by the same 2 executives from yesterday. But today his expression was different, more alert, more curious. He was waiting for something. "Good morning, Mr. Zhang," Patricia began, her diplomat voice firmly in place. "Thank you for agreeing to continue our discussions. As requested, we have Ms. Collins with us today." Mr. Zhang's eyes moved to Amara. He nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement that somehow carried more weight than all of Patricia's polite words. Then he spoke in Mandarin, his tone formal but warmer than it had been yesterday. "Ms. Collins, thank you for joining us. We noticed yesterday that you understood our concerns even when they were not properly conveyed. We hope your presence today will help us achieve true understanding." The room waited. The official translator opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Zhang held up one hand, still looking at Amara. Amara took a breath. This was the moment. The room, the deal, the truth, it all balanced on what she said next. "Mr. Zhang thanks me for being here," Amara said clearly in English. "He says they noticed yesterday that I understood their concerns even when the translation failed to convey them properly. He's hoping that my presence will help achieve genuine understanding, not just polite conversation." The room went completely silent. It wasn't just that she'd translated. It was that she'd translated the subtext, the unspoken criticism embedded in his polite words. She made explicit what everyone had been dancing around. Patricia's jaw tightened. Michael stared at her like she'd just appeared out of thin air. The official translator looked down at her notes. Mr. Zhang smiled slightly. It wasn't a large smile, but it transformed his face, made him look less like a stern executive and more like a person who'd just been handed something he'd been searching for. He spoke again in Mandarin. "Already, this is better. Ms. Collins, please ask Ms. Patterson if she is prepared to hear difficult truths today, or if she prefers the comfortable lies we have been exchanging." Amara felt her heart hammering in her chest. This was the test. This was Mr. Zhang pushing to see if she would actually deliver on her promise of honesty. Every eye in the room was on her. "Mr. Zhang asks if you're prepared to hear difficult truths today, Ms. Patterson, or if you prefer to continue with the comfortable lies you've been exchanging." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Patricia's face went pale, then flushed red. Michael leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. Several junior executives exchanged shocked glances. Patricia started, then stopped. She visibly gathered herself, her hands pressing flat against the table. "Tell Mr. Zhang that I am always prepared to hear the truth. That's why Ms. Collins is here." Amara translated that into Mandarin, keeping her tone neutral and professional. Mr. Zhang nodded, seemed to consider something, then began speaking at length. His words were measured but firm, laying out a series of concerns that cut straight to the heart of the deal. "Mr. Zhang says," Amara began, "that yesterday's discussion revealed a fundamental problem. The contract language your company provided contains clauses that appear reasonable in English, but when examined in their practical application, they place all liability on the Chinese side while protecting Meridian Global from consequences. Specifically, Section 12, Subsection 4, which your translator described as standard risk allocation, actually translates to the Chinese partner assumes all financial responsibility for any failures, including failures caused by Meridian Global's own negligence. Patricia's face had gone from red to white. That's not. We didn't intend. Mr. Zhang continued speaking, and Amara translated without pause. He says that when his legal team reviewed the English contract against the Chinese translation provided by her translator, they found 17 instances where meaning was altered to sound less aggressive. Small changes. A word here, a phrase there. But together, they create a contract that appears balanced, but is actually designed to exploit the partnership. That is absolutely not true, Patricia said, her voice rising. Our intention has always been. Ms. Patterson. Amara's voice was quiet but firm. He's not finished. Patricia fell silent, and Amara could see the fury building behind her eyes. But she stayed quiet because Mr. Zhang was still speaking, and now everyone in the room understood that Amara was their only reliable link to what he was actually saying. Mr. Zhang says, Amara continued, that he doesn't believe this was your personal intention. He believes the problem is systemic, that your company has been operating under the assumption that Chinese partners will not carefully examine English contracts, or that cultural politeness will prevent them from directly confronting problems. He says this is a form of institutional arrogance that has no place in genuine partnership. The room was so quiet that Amara could hear the ventilation system humming in the ceiling. On screen, the female executive beside Mr. Zhang leaned forward and said something in rapid Mandarin. Amara caught every word. The woman beside Mr. Zhang, her name is Ms. Lu Chun, says that they came to this negotiation with hope, not suspicion. They wanted to believe Meridian Global was different from other Western firms they dealt with. But yesterday's translation failures, combined with today's contract revelations, suggest that your company views them as marks, not partners. Now wait just a minute. Michael started to stand. Please sit down, Amara said, not looking away from the screen. They're not finished, and if you interrupt now, they'll walk away permanently. Michael slowly sank back into his chair. On screen, Mr. Zhang said something else, shorter this time, and his tone had shifted slightly. Not quite softer, but less accusatory. More tired. Mr. Zhang says, Amara translated, that he's telling you this directly because Ms. Collins's presence here today suggests you might be capable of change. If you were completely without integrity, you would have refused their request to include me. The fact that you agreed means there's a possibility, small but real, that you actually want an honest partnership. Patricia's hands were shaking slightly on the table. She looked like someone who'd just been forced to see herself in a mirror and hadn't liked what she saw. When she spoke, her voice was strained but steady. Tell Mr. Zhang that he's right. Tell him that I'm looking at this contract with new eyes, and I'm horrified by what I'm seeing. Tell him that I don't know if these changes were deliberate or the result of layers of corporate process creating distance from intention. But either way, they're unacceptable. Amara translated, and as she spoke, she saw Mr. Zhang's posture change slightly. He was listening, really listening, in a way he hadn't been before. Patricia continued, and Amara kept translating, falling into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Tell him that I'm prepared to have our legal team review every single clause with complete transparency. Tell him that if he has questions about intention or implementation, I will answer them directly, without filters. And tell him that I'm grateful to him for being honest enough to risk insulting us, because that honesty is the only foundation worth building on. As Amara finished translating, Mr. Zhang sat back in his chair. He exchanged glances with Ms. Lu Chun and the third executive, a younger man who'd been silent until now. They had a brief conversation in Mandarin, too quick for most translators to catch, but Amara heard every word. He could be lying, Ms. Lu Chun said. She could be lying for him, the younger man added, glancing at Amara. No, Mr. Zhang said quietly. Listen to her voice. Listen to how she translates. She's not smoothing the edges. She's giving us everything exactly as it said. That's what integrity sounds like. Mr. Zhang turned back to the camera and spoke in English. Ms. Patterson, we appreciate your directness. We are willing to continue this negotiation, but we have conditions. I'm listening, Patricia said. First, Ms. Collins must be present for all remaining discussions. Second, all contract language must be reviewed by independent legal counsel acceptable to both parties. Third, we require a complete audit of all previous translations to identify where meaning may have been altered. Done, Patricia said without hesitation. All three conditions. Agreed. Mr. Zhang nodded slowly. Then we will continue. But first, I have a question. His eyes moved to Amara. Ms. Collins, where did you learn Mandarin? Your translation is not just accurate. It captures cultural context. This does not come from classroom study. Amara felt every person in the room turn to look at her. This was the question she'd been avoiding, the one that opened doors to parts of her past she'd kept carefully locked away. But Mr. Zhang had asked directly, and after everything she'd just demanded in terms of honesty from everyone else, she couldn't hide behind evasion. I learned in Shenzhen, she said quietly. My mother took contract work there when I was 16. We lived in worker housing near the port district for 3 years. I picked up Mandarin because I had to, because understanding what people really meant was the difference between my mother getting paid fairly or getting cheated. Your mother was a contract worker? Ms. Lu Chin asked, leaning forward with sudden interest. Yes. Assembly line work, quality control, logistics coordination. Whatever jobs were available for foreign workers without advanced degrees. And you? Mr. Zhang asked. What did you do? I helped her. Translated when I could. Watched when translation wasn't enough to fix the problem. Amara paused, remembering. I saw a lot of contracts that said one thing in English and meant another thing in practice. I watched companies use language barriers as weapons. I watched my mother lose wages because someone decided that timely payment could mean 90 days instead of 30, and by the time we understood what happened, the company had restructured and the debt was legally erased. The room was absolutely silent. Even Patricia had stopped taking notes, just staring at Amara with an expression that might have been shame. So, when you say you translate honestly, Mr. Zhang said slowly, you are not just offering a professional service. You are refusing to be complicit in the system that hurt your family. Yes, Amara said simply. Mr. Zhang sat back and said something in Mandarin to his colleagues. Then he looked directly at the camera, his expression serious but no longer cold. Ms. Collins, thank you for your honesty. It helps us trust what happens next. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes. They reviewed contract clauses one by one, with Amara translating every question, every concern, every moment of confusion or disagreement. The official translator took notes, but didn't speak. She'd been quietly relieved of her primary duty, though no one had explicitly said so. It was slow work, painstaking and precise. Each clause required examination from multiple angles. When Mr. Zhang questioned the language around intellectual property transfers, Amara translated not just his words, but his tone, the way his concern deepened when Patricia's initial response was too vague. When Ms. Lu Chan pointed out discrepancies in liability limits, Amara made sure everyone understood that this wasn't just legal nitpicking. It was about whether the partnership would be truly equal or subtly exploitative. There were moments of real tension. Michael, the older executive, tried twice to redirect the conversation away from uncomfortable topics, using corporate jargon and diplomatic deflection. Both times, Mr. Zhang caught it through Amara's translation and pushed back firmly. We are not here to perform negotiation, he said through Amara's voice. We are here to actually negotiate. The difference matters. Patricia took notes throughout, her pen moving rapidly across a legal pad. Several times, she paused the discussion to consult with legal counsel, and each time, she came back with more direct answers than before. It was like watching someone learn a new language in real time. Not Mandarin, but the language of genuine transparency. The younger Chinese executive, who Amara learned was named David Wu, spoke up near the end of the session. His question cut to the heart of everything they've been dancing around. Ms. Patterson, why should we believe this change is permanent? What stops your company from reverting to old practices once this deal is signed and we're committed? Patricia didn't answer immediately. She looked at Amara, then at the screen, then down at her notes. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been all morning. I can't promise that everything will change overnight. What I can promise is that this conversation has been recorded, that your concerns are now formally documented, and that I will personally ensure that accountability measures are built into every stage of implementation. But you're right to be skeptical. Trust isn't given. It's earned through consistent action over time. Amara translated, and she saw something shift in Mr. Zhang's expression. Not complete trust, but the beginning of something that might become trust eventually. Patricia, to her credit, didn't try to defend the indefensible. When problems were identified, she acknowledged them without excuse. When Mr. Zhang pushed back on vague language, she agreed to make it specific and invited his team to propose alternative wording. It wasn't comfortable, and there were moments when her frustration showed through a tightness around her mouth, a brief pause before responding, but she stayed committed to the process. Near the end, Mr. Zhang asked about implementation timelines, and the discussion revealed another layer of miscommunication that had been festering beneath the surface. The Chinese side had been working on an 18-month rollout plan, while Meridian Global's documents suggested a 6-month aggressive push. Neither side had explicitly stated their assumptions, and the translators hadn't caught the discrepancy because everyone had used the vague term reasonable time frame. 18 months is too slow for our board, Patricia said, then stopped herself. But 6 months might be unrealistic given the complexity. What if we worked backward from the goal and identified which elements need more time and which can be accelerated? It was a simple suggestion, but it represented a fundamental shift from dictating terms to collaborative problem solving. Amara translated it and saw Ms. Lu Chen nod approvingly. By the time Mr. Zhang ended the video call with a promise to reconvene in 2 days, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. It wasn't warm exactly, but it was no longer hostile. It was the feeling of people who decided to try being honest with each other, even though honesty was harder than the comfortable lies they'd been telling. As the screen went dark, Patricia stood up and looked directly at Amara. My office. Now, everyone else, give us the room. The executives filed out, some of them glancing back at Amara, with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Nicole caught her eye from the doorway and gave a small, encouraging nod before disappearing into the hallway. When the door closed, the silence felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Patricia walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, her back to Amara, her shoulders rigid with something that looked like barely controlled emotion. Outside, the city sprawled beneath them, millions of people going about their lives, completely unaware of the small earthquake that had just happened in this room. Do you know how long I've been with this company? Patricia asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. No, ma'am. 23 years. I started as a junior analyst, fresh out of business school with more ambition than sense. Worked my way up through every level, associate, manager, director, VP, and finally COO. Sacrificed relationships, health, any semblance of work-life balance. She turned around, and her face was drawn, tired in a way that went beyond one difficult meeting. The harsh fluorescent light made her look older than she probably was, or maybe it just made her look as old as she felt. I built my entire career on being the person who gets deals done, the person who finds solutions, the person who makes things work, no matter how complicated or impossible they seem. Yes, ma'am. And today, a 20-something delivery girl walked into my conference room and showed me that everything I've built, every success I've celebrated, every promotion I've earned, is constructed on a foundation of institutional dishonesty that I was either too stupid or too complicit to see. Her laugh was bitter, painful to hear. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Amara said nothing. There is nothing to say that wouldn't sound either defensive or accusatory, and both would be wrong. Sometimes the only appropriate response to someone's pain was silence and the willingness to witness it. Patricia sat down heavily in her chair, the leather creaking under the sudden weight. She looked smaller somehow, diminished not in authority, but in certainty. The worst part is that you're right. We do assume Chinese partners won't push back hard enough. We do use complexity and cultural politeness as shields. We do let translators smooth away anything that might cause discomfort or slow down the process. And we've convinced ourselves that this is just business, just how things are done, just the necessary compromises of operating in a global marketplace. It doesn't have to be, Amara said quietly. No, apparently it doesn't. Patricia looked at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been resentment, or might have been both tangled together in a way that even she couldn't separate. HR is going to offer you a contract. Proper consultant rate, not the token payment we gave you today. You'll be part of this negotiation until it's complete. Beyond that, I can't promise anything because honestly, I don't know what happens next. And after that, that depends on whether you want to keep doing this, whether we're capable of actually changing how we operate, whether any of this is real or just performance because we're afraid of losing money. Patricia's smile was bitter. I honestly don't know yet. Neither do I, Amara admitted. At least you're honest about it. Patricia stood up and extended her hand. Thank you for today. I mean that, even though part of me wants to hate you for making me see things I've been avoiding. Amara shook her hand, surprised by the firmness of the grip. You're welcome, Ms. Patterson. As Amara left the office and walked toward the elevator, she felt the weight of the day settling onto her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She'd done what she'd promised, translated honestly, held the line on truth, but she didn't feel triumphant. She felt exhausted and uncertain and aware that she'd just stepped into something much larger and more complicated than one business deal. Nicole was waiting by the elevator bank, a knowing smile on her face. You made quite an impression up there. I just translated. No, you did a lot more than that. Nicole pressed the elevator button. The whole building is talking about it. The delivery girl who stopped a deal from falling apart by telling the truth. It's like something out of a movie. It doesn't feel like a movie, Amara said tiredly. The best stories never do when you're living them. The elevator arrived, and Nicole held the door. For what it's worth, I think you did something important today. Not just for the deal, but for showing people that there's another way to do business. As the elevator descended, Amara leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. She thought about her mother, about those 3 years in Shenzhen, about all the times they'd been on the other side of this kind of negotiation. She thought about how it felt to finally be the person holding the power of language, rather than the person being hurt by its weaponization. The elevator reached the lobby, and Amara walked out into the afternoon sunlight. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer in HR, asking her to come in tomorrow to discuss contract terms. Another message from an unknown number, Rachel, the assistant, thanking her for what she'd done. Amara stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building, at all those windows reflecting the sky, at the clouds drifting past the upper floors. Somewhere up there, people were having conversations about what had happened today. Some of them are probably angry. Some are probably relieved. Some probably didn't care at all. But things had changed. She'd made sure of that, and there was no going back. Tomorrow, she'd return and do it again. 2 days after the confrontation that changed everything, Amara returned to Meridian Global Solutions. This time, she wore a new outfit, still simple, still affordable, but professional enough to signal that she belonged in that conference room. The security guard nodded at her without checking his computer. The elevator ride to the 17th floor felt different, like she was traveling a familiar path rather than entering foreign territory. But when she stepped into the conference room, the atmosphere was colder than before. Sharper, more hostile. Patricia stood at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her face carefully neutral. Around her sat the same executives from the previous meeting, but their expressions had hardened. The brief moment of honesty from 2 days ago had apparently worn off, replaced by something that looked like resentment and damage control. Ms. Collins, Patricia said formally, "Thank you for joining us. Please sit." Amara took her seat, noticing the way conversations stopped as she passed. Michael wouldn't meet her eyes. The junior executives who'd thanked her before now studied their laptops with sudden intensity. Only Nicole, standing near the back of the room with a tablet, gave her a small, encouraging nod. The video call connected precisely at 9. Mr. Zhang appeared on screen, flanked again by Ms. Lu Chun and David Wu. But today, his expression was serious in a different way. Not angry, but deeply concerned. "Good morning, Ms. Patterson," he began, speaking in English. "Before we continue with contract negotiations, there is a matter that requires immediate discussion." "Of course," Patricia said, her voice professionally pleasant but tight. "What matter is that?" Mr. Zhang switched to Mandarin, his tone becoming more direct. "We have completed our review of all email correspondence from the past 6 months. Our independent translators have compared the original Chinese messages with the English translations your company received. Ms. Collins, please translate what I'm about to say exactly as I say it." Amara's stomach tightened. She nodded, bracing herself for what was coming. Mr. Zhang continued, his words precise and cutting. "We found systematic alterations to our communications. Not errors, not misunderstandings. Deliberate changes designed to make our concerns sound less serious than they were. In March, we sent explicit warnings about quality control issues in the manufacturing pilot program. We used the phrase unacceptable defect rates that violate industry standards and put patient safety at risk. Your translator converted this into areas for improvement in the quality process. Do you see the difference? We expressed urgent concern about safety. You received a suggestion for minor adjustments." Amara translated every word, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. Patricia's face had gone pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding their notes extremely interesting. "In April," Mr. Zhang continued, his tone hardening, "we stated clearly that the proposed liability terms were fundamentally unfair and possibly illegal under Chinese commercial law, creating unacceptable risk exposure for our company. Your translation said we had questions about implementation details and hoped for clarification. Questions, as if we were confused students rather than experienced executives identifying legal problems." As Amara translated, she watched Michael's face turn red. He started to speak, then thought better of it, his mouth pressing into a thin line. "In May," Mr. Zhang said, pausing for emphasis, "we informed you in writing, and I want to be very clear about this. We informed you that we were seriously considering terminating preliminary discussions unless significant structural changes were made to the partnership framework. We listed 5 specific concerns that required immediate attention. Your translator reported that we were excited to move forward but hoped for minor adjustments to optimize the partnership. Excited. We were threatening to walk away, and you were told we were excited." The silence in the room was suffocating. Amara continued translating, watching the implications sink in across different faces. Some executives looked genuinely shocked, like they truly hadn't known. Others looked caught, their expressions carefully neutral in a way that suggested they'd suspected but hadn't asked questions. "These are not small differences," Mr. Zhang said, his voice carrying the weight of betrayal. "These are lies, deliberate distortions that prevented us from having honest conversations about serious problems. They wasted our time, damaged trust, and nearly destroyed a partnership that could have benefited both companies." The room erupted. Michael stood up, his face flushed with anger and defensiveness. "That's an incredibly serious accusation. We would never deliberately." "Please sit down," Amara said quietly but firmly. "He's not finished." Michael sat, but his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Beside him, a junior executive was scrolling through her laptop frantically, probably pulling up old emails to check the translations herself. Ms. Luchan leaned forward and spoke, her Mandarin rapid and forceful. Amara translated without pause. "Ms. Luchan says that when they discovered these discrepancies, they considered walking away entirely. They felt betrayed, manipulated, and disrespected. The only reason they're still in this conversation is because Ms. Collins proved that at least one person in your organization is capable of honesty." Patricia finally found her voice. "I want to be absolutely clear. I was not aware of these translation issues. If what you're saying is accurate, then someone in this organization engaged in serious misconduct without my knowledge or approval." Amara translated, and Mr. Zhang responded immediately in Mandarin. Ms. Patterson asks us to believe she didn't know, but she hired the translators. She reviewed the communications. She made decisions based on information she never questioned. Ignorance is not innocence, it is negligence. As Amara translated those words, she watched Patricia's expression crumble slightly. The COO had spent 2 days probably convincing herself that the problems were isolated, fixable, not really her fault. Now she was being told that her lack of awareness was itself the problem. "You're right," Patricia said quietly. Amara almost didn't translate it, thinking it was too soft to hear, but Patricia repeated it louder. "You're right. I didn't question the translations because they told me what I wanted to hear. They made my job easier. They let me report good news to the board instead of problems. I am responsible for that failure." Amara translated, and for the first time since the call began, Mr. Zhang's expression softened slightly. Not much, but enough to suggest that accountability might matter more than excuses. David Wu spoke next, his question pointed and direct. "Ms. Patterson, what systems do you have in place to prevent this from happening again?" It was the perfect corporate question, the kind that should have an easy answer about processes and oversight and quality control. But Patricia didn't give an easy answer. She took a long breath and said, "Honestly, none that I trust anymore. The systems we had in place were supposed to catch these problems, and they failed. Or more accurately, I failed to create systems that valued truth over convenience." Amara translated, and she could feel the shift in the room. Some executives looked horrified that Patricia was being so openly vulnerable. Others looked relieved that someone was finally saying the difficult thing instead of hiding behind corporate language. "So what do you propose?" Mr. Zhang asked through Amara. Patricia looked at the screen, then at her team, then back at the screen. "Complete transparency. All communications go through Ms. Collins. All contract language gets reviewed by independent counsel you choose, not just counsel we hire. Monthly audits of all correspondence to verify translation accuracy. And if we find additional instances of deliberate mistranslation, the people responsible will be terminated, regardless of their position in the company." The room went silent. Michael's mouth fell open slightly. A junior executive actually gasped. Mr. Zhang conferred briefly with his colleagues in Mandarin, too quiet for anyone but Amara to hear clearly. She caught fragments, unprecedented, risky, possibly genuine, before he turned back to the camera. "Ms. Collins, please tell Ms. Patterson that her proposal is acceptable. But we have one additional requirement. We want access to all original translation records. Every email, every document, every conversation from the beginning of our relationship. We want to know the full scope of what was hidden from us." Amara translated, and Patricia nodded immediately. "Done. My assistant will compile everything by end of business today." The meeting continued, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. They weren't negotiating from positions of power and suspicion anymore. They were negotiating from acknowledgement of failure and tentative hope for something better. It was slower, more careful, more honest. Near the end of the session, Ms. Lu Chun asked a question that seemed to come from genuine curiosity rather than strategic positioning. "Ms. Collins, where did you learn to translate with such precision? Not just the language, but the context, the implications, the things that live between the words." Amara had known this question would come eventually. She'd been avoiding it for 2 days, but now, sitting in this room full of people confronting uncomfortable truths, evasion felt like its own kind of dishonesty. "I learned in Shenzhen," she said, speaking in English so everyone could understand. "My mother took contract work there when I was 16. We stayed for 3 years." "What kind of work?" Ms. Lu Chun asked, her tone gentle, genuinely curious rather than interrogatory. "Whatever work was available. Factory assembly, quality inspection, warehouse logistics." She had a degree in supply chain management from a community college back in Michigan, but that didn't mean much to the hiring agencies in China. They saw a Black American woman without connections, without fluent Mandarin, without the right credentials from the right schools, and they offered her the jobs no one else wanted. The night shifts, the positions with impossible quotas, the contracts that look legitimate until you read them carefully. Amara paused, surprised by how much detail she was sharing. But something about the moment demanded it. The room had demanded honesty from everyone else. It was only fair that she offer her own. I learned Mandarin because I had to. Because the contracts they gave my mother were deliberately complicated, full of clauses that sounded reasonable in English, but meant something completely different in practice. Because understanding the difference between what people said and what they meant was the only way to protect her. "Did you succeed?" Mr. Zhang asked quietly, his formality softening into something more human. "In protecting her? Sometimes." Amara's voice was steady, but the memories pressed against her chest like physical weight, making it hard to breathe. "I learned to listen for the gaps between words, for the places where translators smoothed things over or made deliberate changes, for the way people's tones shifted when they were saying something polite that meant something cruel. I learned that in Mandarin, you can say we appreciate your hard work in a way that actually means we're about to cheat you, and there's nothing you can do about it." The room had gone completely silent. Even the executives who'd been hostile earlier were listening now, their attention caught by the rawness of what she was describing. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was real pain, real loss, real consequences of the systems they'd all been participating in. There was one contract in particular, Amara continued, the memory surfacing with painful clarity. She'd spent years trying not to think about it, but now it seemed important to remember, to share, to make these people understand what their convenient translations actually cost. My mother had been working for a factory that made components for medical devices. Good work, decent pay, the kind of job that felt like maybe we could build something stable. They offered her a promotion, shift supervisor, significant pay increase, better housing allowance. We'd been living in a tiny apartment in the worker housing complex, sharing a bathroom with 3 other families. This promotion meant we could afford something better. She could see it all in her mind. Their apartment with its cracked walls and flickering lights, the excitement in her mother's eyes when she'd come home with the contract, the way they'd celebrated with dumplings from the street vendor downstairs. The contract was in Chinese and English, with the Chinese version labeled as the official version for legal purposes. Most people just signed. They trusted the English summary, trusted that the company wouldn't cheat them, trusted that their hard work would be rewarded fairly. But I've been practicing my Mandarin for almost 2 years by then, listening to workers talk during breaks, learning the language of contracts and obligations, and the 1,000 small ways companies found to exploit people who didn't understand. "You found something wrong," Ms. Lu Chan said. It wasn't a question. She already knew where this story was going. The English version said she would be promoted to shift supervisor with a salary of 8,000 yuan per month. Clean, simple, straightforward. The Chinese version said she would be responsible for supervising a shift and would receive a maximum possible salary of 8,000 yuan per month based on meeting comprehensive production targets. If she failed to meet those targets, and the contract made it clear they were designed to be mathematically impossible, she'd be paid less than her current salary, and she'd be personally liable for any production shortfalls. Not just reduced pay, actual debt. Patricia leaned forward, her face pale. "That's unconscionable. That's entrapment. That's business," Amara said simply, her voice flat. "At least, that's what the hiring manager told my mother when I translated the real terms. He said every contract had clauses like that it was standard practice in the industry, that we were being difficult and culturally insensitive by questioning it. He said if my mother didn't want the job, plenty of other people would take it without asking questions. And he was right. There were always people desperate enough to sign anything." The room waited, and Amara realized they were all holding their breath, waiting to hear what happened next. "What did your mother do?" David Wu asked softly. She refused the promotion, kept her regular position at the old salary, kept working the assembly line even though everyone knew she'd been offered something better, and turned it down. The other workers thought she was crazy, throwing away an opportunity like that. Amara's voice was quiet now, remembering the aftermath, the way everything had changed. 2 weeks later, they fired her. Said she'd failed to show cultural adaptability and team loyalty. Said she wasn't a good fit for the company culture. They couldn't say she'd refused to sign a deceptive contract, so they found other reasons. Reasons that sounded legitimate on paper. Reasons that made her look like the problem. That's why you understand what we're experiencing, Mr. Zhang said slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. Not theoretically, but from living it. From being on the other side of these translation games. Yes, I watched my mother lose jobs because she understood too much. I watched translators deliberately mistranslate to make exploitation sound like opportunity. I watched companies use language barriers as weapons, and I watched people get hurt because they believed what they were told instead of what was actually written. Amara looked directly at the camera, at Mr. Zhang and his colleagues. That's why I won't smooth over difficult truths. That's why I won't make harsh words sound polite or turn warnings into suggestions. Because I know exactly what happens when translation becomes a tool for deception instead of understanding. I've lived it. My mother lived it. And I refuse to be part of that system ever again. Mr. Zhang sat back in his chair, nodding slowly, his expression complex, sadness, understanding, respect all mixed together. Thank you for sharing that, Ms. Collins. It helps us trust not just your skill, but your integrity. You're not just doing a job. You're preventing what happened to your mother from happening to others. That's exactly what I'm doing, Amara said. And that's exactly why I'll never compromise on honesty, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people. The meeting ended shortly after with concrete next steps, the translation audit, the independent legal review, the restructured contract language. As the screen went dark, Patricia stood up and looked at Amara with an expression that was difficult to read. That must have been incredibly difficult for your mother, she said. And for you. It was, Amara said, but it taught me something important. What's that? That the people with the least power are often the ones who need the truth most. And that language can either be a bridge or a weapon, depending on who's wielding it and why. Patricia nodded, her eyes distant like she was thinking about something painful. I spent 23 years wielding language as a weapon without realizing it. Calling it diplomacy, calling it business acumen, calling it cultural sensitivity. When really, I was just making things easier for myself and harder for people who had less power to push back. The fact that you see that now matters, Amara said. Does it? Or am I just performing awareness because I got caught? It was the kind of question that had no comfortable answer, so Amara didn't try to find one. I don't know yet. Ask me again in 6 months when the systems you promised are either working or quietly forgotten. Patricia's laugh was short and bitter. Fair enough. As Amara left the building that afternoon, Nicole caught up with her in the lobby. That was intense up there. Word is spreading about what you shared. About your mother. I probably said too much. No, you said exactly enough. Nicole paused at the revolving doors. My parents were immigrants too. Jamaican. They worked hotel housekeeping, and I watched them get paid less than they were promised more times than I can count. Language barriers, contract tricks, managers who knew they could get away with it because my parents needed the work more than the employers needed to be honest. I'm sorry. Don't be. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep making people hear the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. Amara stepped out into the afternoon sun, the city noise washing over her like a wave. Car horns, construction equipment, the steady hum of millions of people going about their lives. She thought about her mother, about those 3 years in Shenzhen, about all the contracts that had tried to trap them, and the few times they'd been smart enough or lucky enough to escape. She thought about the woman her mother had been before China. Optimistic, ambitious, believing that hard work and education would be enough to build a decent life. She thought about the woman her mother had become after. Quieter, more cautious, still working, but never quite trusting that the work was what it claimed to be. Still checking every contract twice, still looking for the traps, still waiting for the moment when someone would try to cheat her again. That transformation, from hope to vigilance, was the real cost of all those deceptive contracts. Not just the lost wages, though those had been significant. Not just the lost jobs, though those had hurt. But the lost belief that the system could ever be fair, that honesty was something you could count on, that doing good work would be rewarded rather than exploited. Amara pulled out her phone and called her mother for the first time in 2 weeks. Work had been so intense. Time had gotten away from her, but suddenly she needed to hear her mother's voice more than anything else. "Baby." Her mother's voice was warm, surprised, carrying the slight accent she'd picked up from years of moving between different communities. "Everything okay? You don't usually call in the middle of the day." "Yeah, Mom. Everything's okay. Better than okay. Actually, I just wanted to tell you something." "What's that? Did something happen?" Amara found a bench near a small park and sat down, watching pigeons fight over a discarded sandwich. "Remember how you always told me that the most important thing I learned in China wasn't the language, but understanding why language matters? Understanding how powerful people use words as weapons." "I remember," her mother said quietly. "I remember watching you at 16, 17 years old, reading those contracts with more care than adults twice your age. I remember thinking you shouldn't have to know these things, but being grateful that you did. Well, I'm using it. Everything you taught me, everything we learned together the hard way. I'm using it to make sure other people don't go through what we did." Amara explained the situation briefly. The company, the Chinese executives, the mistranslations, the moment she'd revealed her own history. Her mother listened without interrupting, the way she always had, absorbing information before responding. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Where her mother spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion, trembling slightly. "That's my girl. That's my smart, strong girl. I always knew you'd do something important with what we went through. I just didn't know it would be this. I learned from the best," Amara said, her own throat tight. "No, baby. You learned from someone who learned the hard way. Someone who got beaten down by a system that didn't care about fairness or honesty. But you're not just surviving that system, you're changing it. You're making sure the truth doesn't get lost in translation. You're being the person I needed when I was signing those contracts and hoping for the best. I wish I could have protected you better back then," Amara said. "You protected me more than you know. You saved me from that promotion trap. You caught a dozen smaller problems before they became disasters. You were 16 years old, shouldering burdens that weren't yours to carry, and you did it with more grace and intelligence than most adults could manage." Her mother's voice grew stronger, more certain. "And now you're using those same skills to help people with actual power understand what it's like to be on the other side. That's not just protection, baby. That's justice." After the call ended, Amara sat on that bench for a long time, watching the city move around her. Office workers hurried past with coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware of the small revolution happening in corporate towers above them. She thought about the younger version of herself, hunched over contracts in their tiny apartment, using determination and a cheap dictionary app to decode language deliberately designed to confuse. She thought about her mother's face when Amara had explained that the promotion was a trap, the mixture of disappointment and relief and quiet pride. She thought about all the times they'd failed, the contracts they'd signed because they didn't catch the problems in time, the jobs her mother had lost because understanding the truth wasn't enough to change the power dynamic, the exhaustion that had settled into her mother's bones. All of it had been leading to this, to standing in a corporate boardroom and refusing to let language be used as a weapon, to forcing powerful people to hear truths they'd been avoiding, to being the bridge her mother had needed but never had. Amara started walking, her mind already preparing for tomorrow's session. There was still so much work to do. Contracts to review, translations to audit, systems to build that would outlast any single person's good intentions. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with resistance and setbacks. But for the first time since her mother had been fired from that factory job in Shenzhen, Amara felt like the lessons they'd learned in those hard 3 years might actually mean something beyond survival. They might actually create lasting, deeply meaningful, genuinely transformative change. 3 months passed in a blur of contract reviews, video conferences, and careful translations. Amara became a fixture in the 17th floor conference room, her presence shifting from novelty to necessity. The Chinese delegation requested her for every session, and Patricia stopped fighting it. The deal moved forward slowly, painfully but honestly. Then everything exploded. Amara arrived one morning to find the building swarming with activity. Security had been doubled. Executives moved through the halls with grim expressions and hurried steps. Nicole caught her at the elevator, her face pale. Legal got a subpoena. The translation audit findings leaked to the press. It's everywhere. Amara's stomach dropped. She pulled out her phone and saw the headlines immediately. Corporate giant accused of systematic translation fraud. Meridian Global faces investigation over Chinese partnership deception. Translation scandal rocks international business deal. The conference room was packed when she entered. Patricia stood at the head of the table, flanked by lawyers. The board of directors occupied one side of the table, their expressions ranging from furious to terrified. Mr. Zhang and his team appeared on the screen, their faces carefully neutral. Ms. Collins, Patricia said, her voice strained. Thank you for coming. We need you to translate today more than ever. The senior board member, a white man in his 70s named Richard Blackwell, spoke first. His voice carried the weight of decades in corporate power. This audit was supposed to be internal, confidential. Someone leaked it, and now we're facing legal action, stock price collapse, and public humiliation. Amara translated for Mr. Zhang, who listened without expression. Richard continued, his tone hardening. We need damage control. We need the Chinese delegation to issue a joint statement saying this was all a misunderstanding, that we've resolved our differences, that business will continue as usual. Before Amara could translate, Mr. Zhang spoke in Mandarin. His words were calm, but ice-cold. Tell Mr. Blackwell that we will not help him lie to protect his reputation. Amara translated exactly, watching Richard's face turn red. That's not what I'm asking, Richard started. Mr. Zhang interrupted, still in Mandarin. Tell him that we know exactly what he's asking. He wants us to participate in the same deception that started this problem. He wants us to smooth over the truth because the truth is inconvenient. The answer is no. As Amara translated, the room erupted. Board members argued with each other, voices rising. Patricia tried to restore order, but the chaos had taken on a life of its own. Ms. Lu Chun leaned forward on the screen and spoke in Mandarin, her voice cutting through the noise. Ms. Collins, please tell them that we have made our decision. We are demanding a complete independent investigation. We are demanding public acknowledgement of what happened. And we are demanding that everyone responsible for the deliberate mistranslations be terminated immediately, regardless of their position. Amara translated, and the room fell silent. That's impossible, Richard said. We can't just fire senior staff based on allegations. They are not allegations, Mr. Zhang said through Amara's translation. We have documentation. We have emails. We have proof that senior management approved translation changes designed to mislead us. This was not the work of one rogue translator. This was institutional policy. Patricia's face had gone pale. She looked at Richard, then at the other board members, then at Amara. Is that true? Amara didn't answer. It wasn't her place to confirm or deny, but her silence was answer enough. David Wu spoke next, his words precise and legal. We have consulted with our attorneys. Under Chinese commercial law and international partnership agreements, what your company did constitutes fraud. We have grounds to terminate all discussions, demand financial compensation for wasted resources, and pursue legal action. We're choosing not to do those things, yet, but only if you meet our conditions. As Amara translated, she watched the board members exchange panicked glances. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was survival. What conditions? Patricia asked quietly. Mr. Zhang listed them methodically. 1. Complete independent investigation by a firm we choose, with full access to all documents and personnel. 2. Public statement acknowledging the translation problems and committing to systemic change. 3. Immediate termination of everyone involved in approving the misleading translations. 4. Ms. Collins becomes permanent director of translation integrity, reporting directly to the board, with authority to review all international communications. 5. Monthly audits for the next 3 years, with results shared publicly. The room was silent as Amara finished translating. She'd expected demands, but this was something else. This was a complete restructuring of power, with her at the center of it. Richard stood up, his face purple with rage. This is extortion. You're using a leaked audit to destroy careers and force us into an untenable position. We are using your own misconduct, Mr. Zhang said through Amara, his voice steel, to force you into an ethical position. There is a difference. Patricia held up her hand, silencing Richard. She looked directly at the screen, at Mr. Zhang, and took a deep breath. Give us 24 hours to discuss internally. We'll have an answer tomorrow. Mr. Zhang nodded once. 24 hours. But Ms. Collins should know, we have also offered her a position with our company. If Meridian Global refuses our conditions, she has other options. Every head in the room turned to Amara. She felt the weight of their stares, the sudden realization that she wasn't just a translator anymore. She was a bargaining chip. Mr. Zhang, Patricia began, and Amara noticed she didn't wait for translation. Patricia had learned some of his name pronunciation, finally. The board has voted to accept your conditions. All of them. The investigation will begin next week. We'll issue a public statement this afternoon. And I've been authorized to offer Ms. Collins the position of Director of Translation Integrity, with the terms you specified. Amara translated, watching Mr. Zhang's face carefully. He nodded slowly, then spoke in Mandarin. And the terminations? Patricia's voice was steady but sad. Richard Blackwell resigned this morning. 2 other board members and 4 senior executives are being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. If the investigation confirms their involvement, they'll be terminated with cause. As Amara translated, she felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Justice, it turned out, didn't feel the way she'd expected. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, complicated, necessary, but painful. Then we will continue, Mr. Zhang said, but cautiously, with verification at every step. Trust must be rebuilt slowly. The meeting lasted another hour, working through implementation details. When it ended, Patricia asked Amara to stay. I need to know your answer, Patricia said. Will you take the position? Amara had been thinking about this since yesterday. I have conditions too. Of course you do. Patricia almost smiled. What are they? I want authority to review all international partnerships, not just this one. I want a team, not just me doing everything alone. I want protection from retaliation if I find problems. And I want a budget to hire translators from non-traditional backgrounds, people who learned languages the way I did, because they had to. Patricia pulled out a notepad and started writing. Done. What else? I want quarterly training for all executives on how translation bias and language barriers get weaponized in business. I want it mandatory, including for board members. Done. Anything else? Amara paused. I want my mother to be at my first board presentation. She's the reason I know how to do this. She deserves to see what came from what we went through. Patricia's eyes glistened slightly. That's not a business condition, but yes. Absolutely yes. 2 weeks later, Amara stood in a much larger conference room on the 20th floor, addressing the full board of directors and senior management. Her mother sat in the back row, wearing her best dress, navy blue with small flowers, the one she saved for special occasions. Her face glowed with pride so fierce it was almost painful to witness. Nicole had helped arrange everything, making sure Amara had the technical support she needed, the right presentation equipment, the confidence that comes from knowing someone has your back. The room held 40 people. Every seat was filled. Some executives stood against the walls. This wasn't optional attendance. This was the beginning of the mandatory cultural change Mr. Zhang had demanded. The presentation was titled Language as Power, Building Ethical International Partnerships. Amara had worked on it for 2 weeks, refining every slide, choosing every word carefully. This wasn't just about what had gone wrong. It was about why it had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. She spoke for 40 minutes, her voice steady and clear. She detailed not just the specific failures with the Chinese deal, but the underlying assumptions that had made those failures possible. She talked about institutional biases, about the dangerous assumption that language barriers favored English speakers, about how every time someone smoothed over a difficult truth in translation, they were choosing short-term comfort over long-term partnership. She showed specific examples, side-by-side translations of the same document. The original harsh criticism in Mandarin next to the softened English version. The pattern was undeniable once you saw it clearly. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She talked about her mother, about Shenzhen, about the promotion contract that had been designed to trap workers with impossible quotas and personal liability. She showed how the same tactics used on factory workers were being deployed in billion-dollar deals, just with better suits, fancier conference rooms, and more sophisticated legal language. The mindset is identical, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Find someone who doesn't fully understand the language. Create complexity that favors you. Use their trust against them. The only difference is scale, and the fact that when you do it to a major Chinese corporation, they have the resources to fight back. My mother didn't. When she finished, the room was silent. Then someone started clapping. It was Mr. Zhang, joining via video feed from Shanghai, his hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. Ms. Liu Chen joined him. Then David Wu. Others in the conference room joined in, tentatively at first, then with what seemed like real conviction. Her mother was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. After the presentation, executives lined up to talk to her. Some apologized, their voices quiet and sincere. Some asked detailed questions about implementation and training. Some looked uncomfortable but committed to learning, which was perhaps the most honest response. Patricia introduced her to division heads who manage partnerships in Europe, South America, and Southeast Asia. All of them needed her expertise, all of them suddenly aware of how fragile their international relationships might be. Nicole brought her coffee and whispered, "You just changed this entire company. Not just the policies, the culture. People are scared, but they're also listening." But the moment that mattered most came at the end, when her mother approached, pulled her into a tight embrace that smelled like lavender lotion, and whispered with her voice breaking, "Your father would be so proud. I'm so proud. You took our pain and turned it into something that protects people, that changes things." 3 months later, the deal finally closed. The contract was clean, honest, truly balanced. Both companies issued a joint press release highlighting the critical importance of translation integrity in international partnerships. Several other corporations reached out to Amara, wanting to hire her team to review their processes. She hired carefully a Jamaican woman who'd learned Spanish working hotels, a Vietnamese man who'd taught himself English and French to help his family navigate immigration systems, a Mexican woman whose Mandarin was better than her English because she'd spent years translating for her grandmother's import business. People who understood that language could be a weapon or a bridge, and who'd chosen to make it a bridge. On the 1-year anniversary of that first delivery to the 17th floor, Amara received a package. Inside was a gift from Mr. Zhang and his team, a beautiful calligraphy scroll with characters in both Chinese and English. Truth requires courage. Understanding requires honesty. Change requires both. She hung it in her new office, right where she could see it every day. That afternoon, a delivery worker arrived with lunch for the executive floor. A young Latina woman who looked nervous and distinctly out of place in her red uniform. Security gave her a hard time about proper building access. Executives walked past without seeing her. Amara watched from her office door, remembering. Then she walked over, smiled at the delivery worker, and said in Spanish, "Thank you for bringing this. Your work matters. People see you." The young woman's face lit up with surprised gratitude. As she walked away, Amara thought about that first day when she'd been invisible, dismissed, underestimated. She thought about the moment she'd spoken Mandarin and frozen the room. She thought about every difficult conversation, every uncomfortable truth, every time she'd refused to smooth the edges off reality. They'd laughed because they thought she didn't understand. They were wrong about the language. They were wrong about her. And in being wrong, they created space for something better to exist. Amara returned to her office, opened her laptop, and started reviewing contracts for a new partnership in Brazil. There was work to do. There would always be work to do. But now she had the authority, the resources, and the team to do it right. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Just closed on the house. First one I've owned. Thank you for everything, baby. Amara smiled. The house her mother had just bought was paid for partially with the consultation fees from the work Amara had brought her in on. Reviewing supply chain contracts from a worker's perspective, identifying the tricks she'd learned to spot years ago. They were both finally free from the system that had exploited them. Better yet, they were changing that system so fewer people would be exploited in the future. That, Amara thought, was what justice actually looked like. Not revenge, not destruction, but transformation, taking what hurt you and using it to heal others. She went back to work, translating honestly, building bridges, refusing to let language be used as a weapon ever again. It was exactly what she was meant to do. If you've ever been dismissed because someone assumed you didn't understand, what would you do with the power to finally make them listen? Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who turn being underestimated into their greatest advantage.